Hey everyone, welcome back to the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we're talking major tech news, foundation models being favorites among coders, and other things. Look, I'm going to start with you. People from Cursor and otherwise continue to see use mostly of the Claude models as people's favorites. However, O3 from OpenAI seems to be gaining traction in the coding community among developers, etc. As someone who is writing code on a daily basis, I'm curious what are your thoughts on what maybe at the high level, why some models are preferred over others, and then kind of at the more granular level, why Claude right now, what's good about O3 and helping it climb leaderboards, etc.
Yeah, so all of Claude 3.7, O3, O4, all these models are reasoning models, which we've talked about before. If anyone's listening, a reasoning model is only different from the typical ChatGPTs in that it will think about its steps and kind of curate a plan before it executes against it. And that has tended to cause better coding, better math, better science for stuff where like accuracy is paramount and accuracy is reached as a conclusion of doing a couple of thoughtful steps. These reasoning models are really, really good. For the longest time, the Claude models have been the best in class for it. They've been reasoning kind of by default. ChatGPT introduced O1, then they've now since evolved to O3. They skipped O2 for some reason, and they've also released an O4, where each one of these models just kind of, they're all kind of competing on the same benchmarks where simple coding accuracy and the ability to ingest as much content as possible leads to much better code. I've generally been using 3.7. I was probably like pretty early to trying to use it, but I've now switched myself to the auto mode because I've started using Cursor for non-technical stuff. I'll have it kind of put together documentation, write down markdown like projections and plans and analyze data, and then also do coding, for which I found that the Claude models are still pretty good, but also like Cursor's just auto tool choice seems to be fairly intuitive. I think what's really happening on ChatGPT side is that they're really leaning into developer quality of life, and developer quality of life depends on how accurately can you call tools and how well can you handle gigantic context. So we saw them release their new 4.1 model, which is very, very good at function calling. It's their first 1 million context model. And I think we're just generally seeing ChatGPT making a more active effort for claiming developer market share, since it seems to be one that's highly, highly revenue generating relative to most of the AI space.
I think that's right. Do you think, as a general strategy, as somebody who will continue to try many, do you think we're going to see seasons like this where, kind of Claude is in vogue right now, whatever their kind of, state of the art headliner model is, OpenAI will have its kind of day in the sun. Maybe we see others, that kind of thing. Or do you think we will see kind of an exponential flywheel, so to speak, where Claude is ahead now and that lead simply begets more and more lead, right? Kind of the
Yeah.
feedback it can get, that kind of thing. Like, I'm curious how you kind of see those two things shaping out.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think we're seeing like deep seek was the first time that we saw like a third party come out of nowhere and kind of steal a lot of the limelight for a while. And deep seek was very, very impressive, obviously, right? I think we're the idea of maintaining a leading edge is a hard one. There'll always be a period where for like maybe a month or so, one new model releases and no one can kind of catch up to it. That was the case with Claude 3.5 for a good long while. The idea of maintaining advantage, I think, is going to be harder, like quite a bit harder. Where I think what's going to be the most interesting question is even using GitHub Copilot, like the VS Code like extension from Microsoft that's now built into their tool. They're copying moves from Cursor. Like it's close to an identical product at this point. And I think especially since like most people aren't educated on Cursor, Cursor is a thing that's mostly like a love and affection of SF and maybe even a little bit of New York. But around the world, people just use VS Code. Companies have contracts with Microsoft, and Microsoft's getting people to turn on GitHub Copilot. What's the first model that it'll choose in there? Probably the one that Microsoft has a deep partnership with, which is OpenAI, right? Most people aren't chasing these benchmarks. They're using these tools in the most naive ways, for which circumstance it feels to me like OpenAI just gets to stay ahead for a long while unless someone comes along with a better positioning. But that's obviously really, really hard to go up against when you're up against Microsoft.
I did just see that Microsoft is now running different providers in their Azure cluster. So I think
Mhm.
Google, I think, is coming online, that kind of thing. So I do wonder if we are seeing the early days of that kind of connection severing, if you will. So
Yeah.
I would do wonder if that distribution channel, call it the Copilot, call it the Microsoft Office suite, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I wonder if that kind of advantage erodes away from OpenAI. think time will tell. But
Out of curiosity, given that you only just started using Cursor, you've been vibe coding with like other tools previously, but do you have a model selection manually set or using auto?
I think I'm using auto. Truthfully, I looked into it, and I think in the settings, the only one that I've selected for the model is 3.7 Sonnet. And so I don't know, just given that I'm so new to the tool, where that is. Like, I don't even know,
Hmm.
just kind of looking at this dashboard pulled up right now. I don't even know where you set the preference of model, unless it is just in the models itself.
I see. It's in the when you have the chat menu up, there will be like an agent, and then it'll say auto on the like just a little bit to the right of the chat box, and you can just change it in there. For which Cursor can allow you to then like they set pretty high limits or pretty low limits on how much of an advanced model you can use, even
Yeah.
if you're paying for it.
Yep.
But they have like accelerated models or that sort of thing, whatever that
Yeah.
means.
Yeah. Looking at that tab line is on auto, and again,
Yeah.
that's probably just where I will stay. But I have found, even anecdotally, compared to Cursor over the last week or so of using it, not quite a week, but it is really good when it gets the right context. I do find it
Mhm.
stumbling a little bit in getting the right context, in which I've had to revert to just like the Claude web UI to
Yeah.
where I know what files
Interesting.
I need it to know, and I just pump
Yeah.
those in and just ask it direct questions there. And the
I
code
see.
output it's clunkier as a workflow, but the code output's better. And it's just
I
simply
see.
because like I've given it like it's I guess said a different way. I haven't found Cursor's context selection yet
Mhm.
to be more than, call it, maybe 75% accurate. You know, three out of four
I
times it gets
see.
it right and it's fine. The fourth time though, it gets it wrong. And like
I see.
it forgets that I have environmental variables set, or it
Yeah.
forgets that I've, got this other file off in somewhere else doing something or whatever. And so it needs to be reminded. Whereas if you kind of string together the UI of a single Claude chat, or sorry, the conversation flow, the iterations, it will have the entire context. So it tends to be a little bit more context rich, but then you end up with slower lead times. You end up with like
Yeah.
hitting thresholds and that daily limits, that kind of things.
Yeah, I do. I find that in general, my workflow ends up being like I know the specific task I'm working on. Cursor will allow you to specify like which folder it should start in or which specific files it should start with. Like there's a little like paperclip icon that once you set that, you can constrain the context a lot. I found that sometimes Cursor will go like still very much off the rails, like especially off like there are commands that I'll run sometimes where it's just like, hey, just add one like documentation thing here. I'll be like, okay, let me search through this part of your code base. Let me search through this part. And I'll like do like
Yeah.
30 something tool calls to just read code and then ultimately execute nothing correctly. That has been a fairly common occurrence. That's been really, really annoying. But ultimately, getting to a system that works well, I find that like between MCP servers, between like being very thoughtful about what initial context you provide and guiding the prompt very specifically, you can get the accuracy rate quite a bit up.
Mhm.
We're actually working on a secure cluster, like one that's like SOC 2 compliant, that's HIPAA compliant for medical and pharmaceutical use cases. And for example, there is a open source implementation of something called KubeSpot. So when you're working in infrastructure, KubeSpot is a kind of template for like compliant by nature, like being compliant first and then building infrastructure on top of that. It's a very large module. It has a lot of pieces, a lot of things you have to be thoughtful about and worry about. And in working on this thing, the way I've generally been going is like, focus on this one element. This one element is in this specific file. I need you to expand on how it's implemented in these 13 ways or something. And that will execute generally correctly. But I'm still not comfortable at the point where I'm like saying implement KubeSpot, for example. Like that's just never going to work.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. I think the other thing that I reflect on regularly, even when Cursor gets something wrong, or I have to do this like weird workaround thing to where I can get where I want to
Mhm.
go, but it takes three extra steps or whatever. The thing I constantly keep reminding myself of is basically two thoughts that are directly related. One is this is basically a 3 year phenomenon. The thing kind of
Yeah.
came out in 2022 and it's incredible. So this is the worst it's ever going to be, which makes me
Mhm.
incredibly kind of optimistic and enthusiastic about all the things that people will build as these things get easier and easier, right? Like just speaking for myself, there are things that I can now very quickly and relatively easily bring into the world that I simply couldn't 3 years ago. And like
Yeah.
yeah, I can't imagine that I am, one of a small number relatively right now, but a growing number over time, I think.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, since you've been like vibe coding in general, you used to use V0. You've played around with some of these like I'm forgetting what the V0 competitors were called, but there's one that was a lot better.
Lovable,
Lovable, that's the
replit,
one.
yeah.
Yeah. Are you still using those or have you migrated fully off of those?
I still use V0. I
Okay.
truly never have like really tested the other ones more than just like one or two kind of whimsical examples just to like directly compare them to V0. I haven't found any reason to
Hmm.
switch. That said, I think if I would have started on a different one, I wouldn't have found reason to come to V0, except for maybe the Vercel infrastructure. So
Yeah.
Vercel and actually a new service called Railway that I've been using are both very easy kind of hosting serverless function container services such that I can spin up things very easily, deploy them to a link so I can do more testing, that kind of thing. And so like the
Hmm.
Vercel integration in that respect still has me gravitating towards V0 to do a lot of my prototyping. So like work that would have been like historically sequestered to whiteboards, notepads, or like even Figma. I'm now just doing directly in V0. And anytime I want to take a project where I'm like, okay, this is actually something I want to kind of productized or, get to production level, then I pull it into what used to be VS Code, but is now Cursor.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, I think I feel like the pattern that will likely emerge is that there is going to be, I think with non-technical folks, like this vibe coding era, it seems to be very heavily going towards like Cursor is a developer tool and vibe coding as a general system happens on these web apps like V0 or Lovable, simply because the integration ecosystem is so crazy there. Like getting something on the cloud is easier than ever before. The only thing that's like the only thing that still feels like it's kind of missing to me though, in such a limited capacity, is just like simple auth or security best practices and that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
where your databases and your web apps can end up public on the cloud, but getting like bot protection and all this sort of stuff is still one step away.
The two ways that I've found the maximum amount of frustration, and it's just because it's with myself, where like the project grows to a point where I'm like, my knowledge has now been exceeded and I don't know how to adequately like troubleshoot this back, is
Yeah.
trying to kind of containerize or like micro service parts of the app so I can sequester them off and test them kind of individually and also off. So even like that Supabase is very like one click integratable with V0 or anything running on Vercel. That's really easy to get set up, but to have it go through all the proper security checks and not accidentally stumble into infinite loops and all these kind of things
Yeah.
that are typical of like auth caching systems is still not perfect. Again,
Yeah.
the reason being is like to do that requires a lot of context. Like you kind of have to have like this kind of systems level view of what you're ultimately trying to build. One thing I have found pretty successful is I have the AI write the README file with very explicit instructions such that it can reference that README file to get the project overview. So anytime it
Okay.
loses context, I have it go back, reference the README file, and then they basically use that singular file as a containerized knowledge base, if you
I see.
will, for the project that like I can get a lot of context information in without having to go get, three or four different code files. And again,
I
that's
see.
not perfect, but I have found that is good. I similarly, kind of funnily enough, the other thing I do is when I run out or when I'm approaching limits in a single chat, either in ChatGPT or in the Claude, I have it do the same thing. Summarize the contents of that chat in like a doc, and then copy
I
paste
see.
that doc into a new chat to save on the input tokens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. At least the nice thing with cursors, it feels like it can just extend infinitely. I don't know if you run into a limit with cursor, but like I've been doing the sort of thing where unless I'm done with a feature, like I just end up keep adding and adding to it, and that definitely like loses context at some point or another. But it's oftentimes easier to just like trust that it can look back a little bit rather than go all the way out.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not a little, not a little.